Britain had survived royal scandals, family divisions, and years of relentless public scrutiny. But according to people familiar with palace life, something far more unsettling was unfolding behind closed doors. It wasn't a public announcement. It wasn't a newspaper headline. It was a silence so unusual that even experienced palace staff began quietly asking one another what had gone wrong. Early that morning, several senior royals unexpectedly cleared their schedules. King Charles, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess Anne, Prince Edward. No official explanation was given. Inside Buckingham Palace, mobile phones were left outside a private meeting room as senior advisors entered one by one before the heavy doors quietly closed behind them. For nearly 2 hours, nobody was allowed to enter or leave. Whatever was happening inside was important enough to remain completely hidden from the outside world. King Charles entered carrying a slim leather folder. He offered no greeting and no small talk. He carefully placed the folder on the polished table before taking his seat. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence became almost impossible to ignore. Finally, Charles looked around the room and quietly said, "The decisions we make today will shape how history remembers this family." His words settled over the room like a heavy weight. William exchanged a brief glance with Catherine, who immediately sensed this wasn't an ordinary palace briefing. Across the table, Princess Anne carefully studied her brother's face. She had watched Charles carry responsibility for decades, but today something felt different. He slowly opened the folder, revealing several documents inside. He looked down at the first page, paused for a moment, and then quietly closed the folder again without allowing anyone else to read it. Confusion spread around the table. Why gather the family's most senior members only to hide the very documents they had come to discuss? Before anyone could ask a question, another knock echoed outside the room. A senior advisor entered carrying a second file. Unlike the first, this one was completely sealed. Without saying a word, he placed it beside the king and quietly left. Charles rested his hand on the envelope but made no attempt to open it. William immediately noticed. Whatever was inside, it clearly mattered. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the palace, Camilla sensed that something wasn't right. Staff members who normally greeted her warmly suddenly became unusually quiet. Conversations stopped as she entered the corridor, and several appointments quietly disappeared from her daily schedule. When she finally asked an aide whether anything had changed, the reply came carefully. "His Majesty is in an important meeting, Your Majesty." Nothing more. Years inside royal life had taught Camilla that silence often revealed far more than words. And today, that silence felt unusually heavy. Back inside the meeting room, Charles finally pushed the folder toward William. William read only the first page, and his expression changed instantly. He looked back at his father and quietly asked, "Are you certain this is the only way?" The room fell silent once again. Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the palace windows, where the gardens stood perfectly still. Without looking back, he softly replied, "Sometimes, the crown demands choices the heart would never make." No one challenged him. No one interrupted. But every person in that room understood one thing. If the truth inside those documents ever became public, the royal family could face one of its most difficult moments in years. And hidden beneath the top page was one final sealed document that nobody, except the king, had yet seen. For several moments, nobody moved. William slowly placed the folder back onto the table, but his eyes never left his father. Whatever he had just read was far from an ordinary royal briefing. Princess Anne quietly reached for the documents and carefully examined each page with the calm expression she was known for. Only once did she pause, just for a second, but Charles noticed immediately. She had understood something the others hadn't. Outside Buckingham Palace, the world carried on as usual. Tourists gathered near the gates while the King's Guard continued their daily routine. News cameras focused on scheduled royal engagements, completely unaware that behind those historic walls, a private meeting was quietly reshaping conversations about the monarchy's future. Inside the room, Charles slowly stood and walked toward the window before speaking. "The monarchy has survived because every generation accepted difficult responsibilities," he said calmly. Now it's our turn. No one interrupted. His words lingered in the silence until Catherine spoke for the first time. If these discussions ever become public, she began before pausing. People won't just question the decision. They'll question the family itself. Charles gave a slow nod. And that's exactly what concerns me. The atmosphere immediately became heavier. Several advisors exchanged uneasy glances. They had attended countless royal meetings throughout their careers, but none had felt quite like this. Then the silence was broken by another quiet knock at the door. An aide entered carrying a small sealed envelope and handed it directly to the king before leaving without saying a single word. Charles looked down at the envelope but didn't open it. William noticed immediately. "What's inside?" he asked. The king remained silent for several seconds before finally replying, "Information that could influence every decision we make from this point forward." The answer only deepened the mystery. If the first folder had already unsettled everyone, what could possibly be hidden inside the sealed envelope? Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the palace, Camilla sensed the atmosphere changing even more. Two senior staff members suddenly ended their conversation as she approached, while another quietly informed her that several afternoon engagements had been postponed. No explanation was offered. No details were shared. Only uncertainty. Looking down the long palace corridor, Camilla realized that for the first time in years, she felt completely outside the conversation. Experience had taught her that silence often arrived before difficult news, and today it seemed to be following her everywhere. Back inside the meeting room, Charles carefully placed the unopened envelope beside the folder and looked around at every person seated before him. "No decisions will be made today," he said after a long pause. "But from this moment forward, every possibility must be considered." Nobody argued. Nobody challenged him. Yet as the meeting slowly came to an end, William couldn't take his eyes off the sealed envelope. Deep down, he sensed it didn't simply contain information. It contained a choice, one that could shape the future of the royal family forever. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Although the meeting had technically come to an end, no one seemed willing to leave the room. William remained seated, his eyes fixed on the sealed envelope resting beside his father. Finally, he broke the silence. If these possibilities become reality, will the family ever recover from the public reaction? Charles looked at his eldest son. The question wasn't unexpected. In fact, it was the very question he had been asking himself for weeks. Instead of answering, he slowly picked up the sealed envelope. Everyone watched closely. Even the advisors leaned forward slightly. For a brief second, it appeared he was finally going to open it. Then, without a word, he quietly placed it back on the table. "Some decisions," Charles said calmly, "cannot be made in the middle of uncertainty. And once they're made, there is no turning back." Princess Anne lowered her eyes. She understood exactly what he meant. Royal history had shown time and again that a single decision could shape public opinion for generations. Across the table, Catherine remained deep in thought. She wasn't focused on tomorrow's headlines. Instead, she was thinking about stability, responsibility, and what this uncertainty might mean for the future generation of the royal family. Outside Buckingham Palace, royal correspondents had already begun noticing unusual activity. Several public engagements had quietly disappeared from the official calendar. Additional security vehicles entered through side gates. Reporters exchanged curious glances, but no official explanation was offered. With every passing hour, speculation continued to grow. Inside the palace, staff members carried on with their duties as though everything was perfectly normal, yet behind polite smiles, questions spread through every corridor. Everyone sensed that something important was approaching, even if nobody knew exactly what it was. Before anyone finally left the room, Charles stood once more and looked at every person gathered around the table. "Until the time is right," he said quietly, "nothing discussed here leaves this room." One by one, everyone nodded in agreement. The advisors departed first, followed by Edward and Anne. William and Catherine were the last to leave. As William reached the doorway, he paused and looked back. Charles was still sitting alone. The folder remained closed. The envelope remained sealed. And for the first time, William realized his father wasn't simply carrying the burden of a king. He was carrying the burden of an entire family. The following morning, Buckingham Palace appeared completely unchanged. Visitors gathered outside the gates, cameras followed the changing of the guard, and tourists smiled as they posed for photographs. To the outside world, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Inside the palace, however, nothing felt ordinary at all. Charles spent the morning alone in his private study. The leather folder rested beside the sealed envelope exactly where he had left them after the meeting. Several times he reached toward the documents, and several times he stopped himself before making a decision. Elsewhere in the palace, William and Catherine met briefly in private. Their conversation was quiet and unusually short. Neither of them attempted to predict what would happen next because they both understood that some questions simply had no easy answers. At the same time, royal commentators and journalists continued speculating about the cancelled engagements and the unusual level of activity inside Buckingham Palace. Without any official information, every small detail became another headline, and every unanswered question gave rise to a new theory. Back inside his office, Charles slowly walked toward the window overlooking the palace gardens. Beyond those walls, thousands of people expected confidence, certainty, and stability from their king. Yet behind every public appearance was a responsibility few could truly understand. Leadership often demanded difficult choices long before anyone else understood the reasons behind them. After standing quietly for several moments, Charles returned to his desk. Without hesitation this time, he picked up the sealed envelope. He looked at it one final time before carefully breaking the seal. No advisors were present. No cameras recorded the moment. No witnesses stood nearby. There was only silence and the immense responsibility carried by the crown. Whatever those documents contained, the decisions ahead would not be remembered because they were easy. They would be remembered because they tested the delicate balance between duty, family, and the expectations of an entire nation. Sometimes history doesn't begin with applause or public ceremonies. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet decision made behind a closed palace door.